Somewhere around 1200 BC, the most advanced, most interconnected world humanity had built up to that point began to die. It didn't fall to a single war, and it didn't fall to a single empire. In the span of roughly 50 years, one long human lifetime, nearly every major civilization ringing the Eastern Mediterranean was destroyed, abandoned, or reduced to a fraction of its former self. Palaces that had stood for centuries burned in a single night. Trade routes that had linked distant empires for 400 years went silent, almost all at once. Writing itself vanished completely in some regions, not for a few years, but for centuries. Historians have a name for this: the Bronze Age collapse. Some call it the first true apocalypse in the written record, an age that ended so thoroughly that the people who came after it had no real memory of how advanced their ancestors' world had actually been. And more than a century after archaeologists first pieced together the pattern, we still don't fully agree on what caused it. Was it foreign invaders that even the mightiest empire on Earth couldn't stop? A climate disaster that quietly starved civilizations from the inside? A string of earthquakes striking at exactly the wrong moment? Or something stranger, an entire interconnected world simply pulling itself apart, node by node, like dominoes? Buried somewhere inside this mystery is also one of the most famous stories ever told. You may know it as the Trojan War. Stay with me, because that connection is real, and it's stranger than the movies made it look. This is the story of the world that was lost, and the century-long detective case still trying to figure out why. To understand how big this collapse really was, you first need to understand exactly what it destroyed, because right before 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean wasn't a patchwork of disconnected tribes scattered around a sea. It was something startlingly close to an early version of a globalized world. By the 13th century BC, 5 or 6 major powers dominated the region, and remarkably, most of them weren't strangers to each other. They were trading partners, diplomatic rivals, in some cases, literal in-laws. Egypt, ruled by pharaohs like Ramesses II, was the undisputed superpower of the age, wealthy, beyond comprehension, militarily dominant, and responsible for some of the largest monuments the ancient world had ever seen. To the north, across what's now Turkey, sat the Hittite Empire, a rival power just as ambitious as Egypt. The two fought each other to a bloody standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, and then did something almost unheard of in the ancient world. They signed a peace treaty. Copies survive today in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, and it's widely considered the oldest surviving peace treaty in recorded history. Decades later, that peace was sealed further still when a Hittite princess traveled south to marry the Egyptian pharaoh himself. Diplomacy, sealed not with ink alone, but with a royal wedding. Across the Aegean Sea, Mycenaean Greece, the world of fortified palace citadels, warrior aristocrats, and gold death masks, controlled a network of powerful city kingdoms: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes. This is the same world that centuries later would be half remembered in legend as the Age of Achilles, Agamemnon, and the war at Troy. We'll come back to that. It matters more than you'd think. Just south of the Turkish coast sat Cyprus, an island so rich in copper deposits that many historians believe the word copper itself is derived from its name. Cyprus wasn't just wealthy, it was essential. Nearly all bronze production in the ancient world depended on copper, and an enormous share of the region's copper came from here. And right in the middle of all of it, on the Syrian coast, sat the city of Ugarit, smaller than the empires around it, but arguably one of the single most important cities in the ancient world, because it was the trading hub, where all of these civilizations actually met face to face. Its archives, written in 6 different languages and scripts, show merchants, diplomats, and royal messengers moving constantly between Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, and the Aegean world, carrying everything from official treaties to shipping complaints to grocery lists. We don't have to take historians' word for how interconnected this world was either. In 1982, divers off the coast of southern Turkey found something extraordinary. A Bronze Age shipwreck, now called the Uluburun wreck, still carrying its cargo after more than 3,000 years underwater. That single ship was hauling copper and tin from at least 2 different regions: glass ingots from Egypt or the Levant, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, ostrich eggshells, Canaanite jewelry, and Mycenaean Greek pottery. The entire sunken inventory of an interconnected trading world frozen in place at the bottom of the sea. This was not a set of separate civilizations that simply happened to exist at the same time. It was a single interlocking system. Bronze depended on tin and copper moving across thousands of miles. Grain moved from Egypt to famine-struck allies. Royal families intermarried across cultures. Kings wrote to each other in surviving letters as brothers and equals. And within a single generation, it was about to come apart at almost every seam simultaneously. The collapse didn't happen in one dramatic year. It happened in overlapping waves across roughly 50 years, but the pattern, once historians laid it all out side by side, is chilling in how systematic it looks. Start with Ugarit, that great multilingual trading hub. Archaeologists found a thick layer of ash and destruction dating to right around 1190 to 1185 BC. And we actually have something extraordinary surviving from the final days of the city. Clay tablets, accidentally baked rock hard by the very fires that destroyed it, preserving letters written in a state of open panic. In one, a local king writes to a neighboring ruler that enemy ships have already been spotted along the coast and pleads for reinforcements immediately. As far as we know, no help arrived in time. Ugarit was never meaningfully rebuilt, and its remarkable multilingual archives simply stop. Around that same narrow window, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, seat of an empire that had stood toe-to-toe with Egypt for generations, was abandoned and burned. The Hittite Empire doesn't slowly decline here. It essentially ceases to exist as a political power within a single generation, its former territory fracturing into smaller successor states. Cyprus, the island whose copper had fed bronze production across the entire region, doesn't escape either. Major sites like Enkomi and Kition show destruction and disruption in this same period, right as the metal trade networks depending on them were already unraveling. Further inland, the city of Emar on the banks of the Euphrates tells a strikingly similar story. Its final tablets, again baked into permanence by the very fire that ended the city, include a scribe's closing note lamenting that enemies had overrun the land, one of the very last administrative documents that city would ever produce. Over in Greece, the story repeats with an almost eerie consistency. The palace at Pylos burns, and in a detail historians still find remarkable, its linear B clay tablets were, like Ugarit's, accidentally fired hard by the very blaze that destroyed the building, preserving them for us to read more than 3,000 years later. What survived are the palace's last bureaucratic records: rations being issued, bronze being gathered, coastal watchers being posted the day-to-day paperwork of a government that had no idea it was recording its own final weeks. Mycenae and Tiryns are also damaged and depopulated around this same time, never returning to their former scale. And the writing system used across this entire world, Linear B, disappears completely. Greece will not have writing again for roughly 300 to 400 years. Now, here's where this story connects to something you almost certainly already know. This exact world. Mycenaean Greece, in its final violent decades, is the same world that later Greek poets would look back on and mythologize as the Age of Heroes. Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, and the legendary 10-year siege of a city called Troy. For a long time, historians assumed the Trojan War was pure invention, dreamed up centuries later. But archaeological excavations at Hisarlik, in northwestern Turkey, the site nearly all historians now accept as the real location of ancient Troy, reveal that one of the city's layers, known to archaeologists as Troy 7A, shows clear signs of violent destruction dated to right around this same collapse window. Nobody can prove the Iliad describes one specific, real war. The poem itself wasn't written down until centuries after these events, passed along orally in fragments and reshaped by generations of storytellers along the way. But the timing here is genuinely striking. A real city, in the right place, destroyed violently, in the exact era when this entire interconnected world was already tearing itself apart. Many historians now suspect that if there's a kernel of real memory buried inside Homer's poem, it may not be a story about one isolated siege at all. It could be a folk memory of the wider chaos of this collapse, compressed by centuries of retelling into the story of a single, more legendary war. Meanwhile, even Egypt, the great survivor of this story, doesn't escape unscathed. Temple inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe repelling a massive confederation of foreign invaders by land and sea, a coalition the Egyptians themselves label in their own records the peoples of the sea. The carved reliefs at Medinet Habu show Egyptian archers raining arrows down onto capsizing enemy ships, warriors wearing distinctive feathered headdresses, and tellingly, women and children traveling alongside the invaders in ox carts. That last detail is an important clue we'll return to shortly. This doesn't look like a professional invading army. It looks like entire displaced populations on the move, searching for somewhere new to live. Egypt wins these battles, according to its own account, but the empire that survives is a shadow of what it had been, weakened and contracting, and it never again becomes the dominant regional force it once was. By the time the dust finally settles, some 40 to 50 years after it began, the Hittite Empire is gone. Mycenaean Greek civilization in its palace-based form is gone. Ugarit is gone. Cyprus's major cities are shattered, and Egypt survives, but severely weakened, having only barely held the line. This wasn't one empire falling to one enemy. It was an entire interlocking system failing in overlapping waves, which is exactly what makes it one of the most genuinely difficult mysteries in the historical record. So, what actually caused all of this? For most of the 20th century, historians had a simple, tidy answer. Today, most serious researchers think the truth is messier, more interconnected, and frankly, more unsettling. Visual: Egyptian relief carvings of sea battle, warriors with distinctive feathered helmets. This was the default explanation for decades, a mysterious confederation of sea-borne raiders and migrants known to us mainly from Egyptian inscriptions, swept through the eastern Mediterranean and simply smashed everything in their path. It's a dramatic story, and it isn't wrong exactly the sea peoples were real, and there's solid evidence connecting them to destruction at multiple sites. But there's a problem historians have never fully solved. We still don't know, with real certainty, who the sea peoples actually were. Egyptian records list several distinct named groups: the Peleset, the Sherden, the Shekelesh, the Danaan, the Ekwesh, among others, and researchers have proposed connections to displaced populations from the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the central Mediterranean. Some scholars have even pointed out an uncomfortable irony. Some of these groups may have included displaced Mycenaean Greeks themselves, meaning some of the invaders blamed for accelerating the collapse elsewhere may have been refugees fleeing that very same collapse back home. And an invasion alone doesn't explain everything in the archaeological record. Some cities were clearly destroyed by violence. Others were simply abandoned, quietly, with no sign of battle at all, which suggests something bigger than a single wave of raiders was already underway. Modern climate science has added one of the most important pieces to this puzzle in the last few decades. Researchers analyzing pollen samples and sediment cores from the region, including cores pulled from the Sea of Galilee and from Cyprus, have found strong evidence of a severe, prolonged drought beginning right around this exact period, potentially lasting a century or more. For societies almost entirely dependent on grain agriculture, a disaster like that isn't an inconvenience. It's an extinction-level threat. Failed harvests year after year, famine, and eventually mass migration as entire populations are forced to move in search of food and water they can no longer find at home. That detail might actually help explain the Sea Peoples themselves, not primarily as conquering armies, but as climate refugees. Entire displaced populations moving in desperation, colliding violently with the societies unlucky enough to be in their path. Several destroyed sites show damage patterns more consistent with earthquakes than with warfare. Walls collapsed straight inward, without the telltale scorch marks of a deliberate sacking. Some researchers, including geologist Amos Nuhr, have proposed something called an earthquake storm, a tight cluster of major seismic events over just a few decades in a region that sits directly along active fault lines. A cluster like that could have devastated ports, palaces, and infrastructure right as these societies were already straining under other pressures. It's tempting to picture this story as entirely external, outside forces battering innocent, thriving societies. But some of the same archives from this era, like the earlier Amarna letters from Egypt's diplomatic files, already describe growing unrest well before the worst of the collapse. Complaints about bandit groups called the Habiru destabilizing the countryside, vassal rulers begging for help against local uprisings, elites squeezing peasant populations for tribute and labor even as conditions worsened. Some historians argue that rigid, top-heavy palace economies where wealth and grain reserves were tightly controlled by a small ruling class simply had no flexibility left once real pressure arrived, and cracked from the inside as much as they were battered from the outside. This is the theory that ties every other suspect together, and it may be the single most important idea in this entire story. Remember that interconnected trading system from Chapter 1? The one where tin from distant mines had to reach the Aegean, where Egyptian grain fed foreign allies during famine, where royal courts depended on trade and diplomacy, stretching across dozens of societies. Systems like that are remarkably efficient. They are also remarkably fragile, because when every part depends on every other part, a shock to one node can cascade through the entire network. Historian Eric Klein, whose research popularized this view, frames it less as a single catastrophe and more as a chain reaction. A drought causes famine in one region. Famine drives migration and unrest. Migrating populations disrupt trade routes elsewhere. Disrupted trade means tin and copper stop reaching the cities that need them to make bronze. Without reliable bronze supplies, armies weaken. Weakened armies can't repel raiders or suppress internal revolts. Add one or two well-timed earthquakes into that mix, and you don't get a single civilization falling. You get a chain reaction tearing through an entire interconnected world, roughly simultaneously, exactly the pattern the archaeological record actually shows. In other words, it probably wasn't any single cause on this list. It was most of them, compounding at once climate stress, mass migration, earthquakes, and internal strain, moving through a tightly interconnected system that had no resilience left to absorb the shock. That's a genuinely uncomfortable idea to sit with for more than a few seconds. We'll come back to exactly why before the end of this video. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the aftermath itself isn't seriously disputed. What followed the Bronze Age collapse is often called the Greek Dark Age, though its effects reached far beyond Greece alone, roughly 3 to 4 centuries where population dropped sharply across the region. Monumental building all but stopped. Long-distance trade shrank to a fraction of its former scale, and, most strikingly, writing itself vanished completely in some places. Mycenaean Greece had a fully functioning writing system, Linear B, used for generations of careful palace record-keeping. After the collapse, it disappears entirely. When writing eventually reappears in Greece, it isn't a revival of the old system, it's an entirely new one. the Greek alphabet, adapted from a script developed by Phoenician traders along the Levantine coast, one of the few societies to weather this era with its trade networks partially intact. Between the old system and the new one lies a genuine, centuries-long gap in the written record, an entire society that, for a time, simply forgot how to write. Archaeological surveys across the region suggest a dramatic, sustained decline in the number of occupied settlements during this period, with populations that don't recover to their former levels for hundreds of years. Skills that had taken centuries to develop large-scale monumental construction, long-distance maritime trade networks, complex bureaucratic administration, didn't just decline. In many places, they disappeared for generations, only to be relearned, slowly and imperfectly, by societies with no direct memory of how their ancestors had done it. There is, at least, one strange silver lining buried in this story. With long-distance tin and copper routes disrupted for so long, smiths across the region were forced to experiment more seriously with a harder, more difficult, but far more abundant metal: iron. What began as a workaround born out of scarcity and desperation eventually matured into an entirely new technological age. Some of the Sea Peoples groups didn't simply vanish once Egypt repelled them either. Many archaeologists now connect one of the named groups from the Egyptian inscriptions, the Peleset, to a population that went on to settle along the coast of Canaan in the centuries that followed, and eventually became known in later Iron Age sources as the Philistines. So, in a strange way, this story doesn't just end in ruin. It also quietly seeds new peoples and new societies into the world that comes after it. By the time the Mediterranean world fully re-emerges from its dark age, it isn't a rebuilt version of the Bronze Age, it's something new. New alphabets. New smaller city-states rather than centralized palace kingdoms. New iron tools and weapons, cheaper and more widely available than bronze had ever been. And, centuries later, wandering poets stitching together fragments of half-remembered oral tradition into the epic poems we now call the Iliad and the Odyssey. The closest surviving thing to a folk memory of the glittering, interconnected, ultimately fragile world that had been lost. It would take the Mediterranean world the better part of half a millennium to rebuild anything resembling the scale and interconnection of what had existed before 1200 BC. And when it finally did, none of the people rebuilding it had any real memory that their ancestors had lived through something so much larger and more sophisticated than the world they'd actually grown up in. Here's the part of this story that keeps historians, archaeologists, and increasingly complexity scientists coming back to it more than 3,000 years later. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was, in relative terms, one of the most interconnected, sophisticated systems the ancient world had ever produced international trade. Shared technology, diplomatic marriages, economies dependent on partners hundreds or even thousands of miles away. For the people living inside that system, it probably felt permanent, unshakable even. Kings wrote to each other in the letters that survive as brothers. Merchants moved goods across the length of the Mediterranean as a matter of routine business. It came apart in about the span of a single human lifetime. Researchers who study the collapse of complex societies more broadly, historians like Joseph Tainter, whose work looks at why advanced civilizations across history tend to unravel, point to a pattern that shows up again and again, long before and long after the Bronze Age. Highly interconnected. Efficient systems tend to be remarkably resilient against small, isolated shocks, and remarkably vulnerable to compounding ones arriving all at once. That isn't a claim about any one society, ancient or modern. It's simply a pattern the archaeological and climate record from this exact period lays out with unusual clarity. The Bronze Age collapse isn't only a story about how one ancient world ended, it's one of the best documented case studies we have of how deeply interconnected civilizations respond when they're placed under sustained, overlapping pressure from multiple directions at once, which is exactly why researchers across completely different fields keep returning to it, arguing over it, and re-examining it more than 3,000 years after it happened. We may never land on a single, tidy answer for what finally tipped this world over the edge. Maybe it really was one dominant cause, still hiding somewhere in evidence we haven't found yet. Or maybe, and this is the possibility, most current researchers find most convincing there was never going to be one clean answer, because the world that collapsed wasn't destroyed by any single blow. It simply had too many of its supports pulled out at once. Either way, the fact that it happened at all, to a world with every reason to believe it was permanent, is worth sitting with for a moment. If you found this as fascinating as I do, I'd genuinely love to know in the comments which theory you find most convincing. Invasion, climate, earthquakes, internal collapse, or the full systems collapse picture that ties them all together. And if the Troy connection caught your attention, let me know. I'm considering a full deep dive into whether the Trojan War has any real historical basis and where the evidence actually points. If you want more of these deep dives into the moments history almost let slip through the cracks, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of this world still buried, waiting to be dug back up.